Our first presenter is John Davis. John Davis is Rewilding advocate for the Adirondack Council, a conservation group working for the ecological integrity and wild character of New York's Great Adirondack Park. John has also worked for decades with Continental Wildlands Group, particularly the Rewilding Institute and Wildlands Network. Lessons from his 7,000-mile trek through the wilder parts of the U.S. East and Southeast Canada are summarized in his book, Big, Wild, and Connected, Scouting an Eastern Wild Way from the Everglades to Quebec. And his wildlife observations around his local wildlife corridor are highlighted in his book, Split Rock Wildway, Scouting Adirondack Park's Most Diverse Wildlife Corridor. I present John Davis.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be part of this Old Growth Conference. I've been privileged to be in a number of these, and they're always very inspiring. Coming from across the lake in Adirondack Park, I would be tempted to say you New Englanders ought to be embarrassed how little wilderness you've protected. New York State, crowded New York State, has protected a lot more wilderness than has northern New England. You've got to catch up. John Leibowitz is working fast to do that. So I'm going to really quickly walk us through some opportunities for rewilding in the Northeast and a few challenges as well. I'm just going to spend about 15 minutes, and then we'll hear from some old growth experts also coming from across the lake, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments. So I would submit to you that actually, and John and David and John Elder also have all said this as well, the Northeastern United States, and to a lesser degree, Southeastern Canada, are rewilding success stories already, but they are very, very far from complete. And perhaps the most complete part of that rewilding story is where I live in Adirondack Park. But there too, it's a far from unfinished story. We have lost our large carnivores. Some of us, including Renee Secor with Mighty Earth, are working hard to try to convince wildlife agencies to be open to restoring these carnivores, but it's a long, hard fight. So while we have watched the great good fortune of forest regain a foothold across most of our region, we still are missing some of our keystone species, and that's part of what I'll be talking about today. This is a fairly typical scene from the High Peaks, giant mountain in the High Peaks in Adirondack Park. So my mentor in conservation was the great wilderness champion Dave Foreman, better known out west than here in the east, but pretty well known here as well. He actually coined the term rewilding about 3 decades ago, and wrote the classic work on rewilding for our continent, a book called Rewilding North America. If you're going to read just one thing about rewilding, I would recommend that book, Dave Foreman's Rewilding North America. In that book, Dave suggests that while land protection and restoration is important everywhere, and we should be doing rewilding work at all scales from the local to the global, realistically, if we want to rewild North America, we should focus in landscapes that are still largely intact. And of course, not surprisingly, those landscapes are most often along mountain ranges. So he proposed that we rewilding advocates focus particularly in 4 or 5, what he initially called mega linkages. Some of us persuaded him, that's an ugly word, it sounds like giant sausages. So we prevailed upon him to change the terminology after the book was published, unfortunately, to continental wildways. He proposed a vast boreal wildway across northern Canada and Alaska. That's probably the most intact of the continental wildways. A much more fragmented one, but still one with much hope for restoration and protection along the Pacific crest and coast. A quite intact one along the Rocky Mountains. There's an excellent effort underway you've probably all heard of called Y2Y, the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative. This wildway is probably the second most feasible to restore in the near term. And then ours is the Atlantic Appalachian Acadian Adirondack Wildway, or simply the Eastern Wildway. In talking about rewilding, we often emphasize keystone species, and in our planning for rewilding, it makes sense to focus on keystone species, particularly the large carnivores, but also smaller keystone species. I don't know how many of you here might call yourselves beaver believers, but thankfully there's a growing movement of people who are, thank you for being one, it's a growing movement, thank you Bill, of people who are dedicated to seeing beavers protected and restored on the landscape. I don't need to go into their many valuable functions, but in thinking about rewilding, think certainly about the large carnivores, but think about other smaller keystone species like beavers. And they have, by the way, come back across much of the Northeast, another rewilding success story. So here's a preliminary map of the Eastern Wildway, or really Eastern Wildways, plural, that Wildlands Network, led by Ron Sutherland, sketched out a few years ago. And interestingly, Ron began this intellectual exercise, also somewhat artistic exercise, without any assumptions about just how much land should be protected. He simply wanted to know what scientifically can we justify as proposing for wildlife corridors and wild core reserves, and what would suffice to save biodiversity across the eastern United States and southeastern Canada. Interestingly, the figure he came up with, that map depicts in wildlife corridors and wild cores roughly 50% of eastern United States and southeastern Canada, in accordance with the half Earth theory that is growing more and more popular, originally propounded by the great conservation biologist Reed Noss and then popularized by E.O. Wilson. Here's a slightly more detailed look at our region, the northeastern United States and southeastern Canada. See, this is a very ambitious proposal. Again, about half of our region would be in wild core reserves and wildlife corridors. I need to emphasize this is not a proposal to relocate towns. This is not a proposal to displace people. It is a proposal to recognize these dark green and yellow areas as being especially important for wildlife, areas where we should take all legal, ethical, compassionate measures to allow wildlife to roam widely and wildly, and where we will give landowners incentives to keep their lands intact, to be kind to the wildlife thereon, where we will strive mightily to fully protect all public lands from commercial exploitation. And eventually, I would hope that would mean phasing out logging on our public lands. I know that's a controversial position, but I think it's an important one for at least some groups to advocate. But this, and we would, in these areas, give high priority for putting safe wildlife crossings on busy roads. The Fisher is another rewilding success story. We had pretty much lost fishers from our region a century or so ago. They have rebounded nicely with the return of forests. And this is another critical species. If you get annoyed by porcupines eating your porch or gnawing on your privy, you should love this predator, the most effective predator of porcupines. Now, an initiative you've probably heard about, and you may have seen this map even if you have not seen the Wildlands Network's even more ambitious map, is the Staying Connected initiative. This is a collaborative of multiple wildlife conservation and land conservation and state agency groups working together to keep our region connected. And the arrows indicate what the Staying Connected initiative folks see as being the most important habitat links or wildlife corridors. I won't describe them individually because there's not time. But in question and answer session afterward, I could say more about them. This did not turn out well, but there's a moose in that photograph. The photos, by the way, I'm showing partly just to emphasize that many good things have happened, and many wildlife species that were essentially eradicated before have come back. And the photos I'm showing here are ones that we have caught on Eddy Foundation lands. Eddy Foundation is a family-endowed land trust on the other side of the lake, working to protect and restore Split Rock Wildway in concert with Northeast Wilderness Trust and other partners. And we've gotten a bunch of great photos through the years of these wide-ranging animals. Somewhere in there is a young bull moose. I think one of the most important habitat links, one of the most important wildways in North America is the connection encompassing all of Adirondack Park and all of Algonquin Park in Ontario and much of the land in between. It is by no means all nearly intact, but there is a chance to keep this passable for wildlife. The A-to-A connection, Algonquin to Adirondack. And this is the area. It goes through the St. Lawrence Valley, where the hardest challenges for wildlife are in the St. Lawrence Valley and within 20 miles or so of the Canadian border, where most of the Canadian population lives. This is a typical scene from northwestern Adirondacks. You see this throughout the A-to-A area, and this, obviously, this is a place curiously called the Gulf Stream. We have a smaller Gulf Stream in our region, you might not have known. I mentioned Split Rock Wildway a moment ago. Split Rock Wildway is a local level wildlife corridor effort. So when we're thinking about rewilding the region, we will need, again, to work at all scales. This is a habitat connection from Lake Champlain to the Adirondack High Peaks. Again, Northeast Wilderness Trust, Champlain Area Trails, Adirondack Land Trust. DEC is critically involved in this. DEC actually has the Split Rock Wild Forest, the largest, that piece right there is Split Rock Wild Forest, largest protected block in the wildlife corridor. Now, I believe we should restore cougars and wolves. I personally think we should actively restore cougars, that is, reintroduce them once we have sufficient social support. With wolves, it's more complicated because wolves have, or coyotes have interbred with wolves. Our eastern coyotes are large. They do sometimes hunt in packs, and they may be as much as a third wolf in terms of genetic material. And with wolves, unlike cougars, there is a chance, not a high chance, but there is a chance they will colonize on their own before too long, because both the males and females may disperse. With cougars, it's almost always the young males who light out for the territory, so to speak. So the chance of natural recolonization by cougars in our region is very slim. It's slightly higher for wolves, but also because we do have wolf genes in our region, I favor doing the best possible job of protecting the connections that wolves might use to recolonize the eastern United States, particularly A to A, and limiting the killing of coyotes. As long as there's an open killing season on this animal, the eastern coyote, there's very little chance of successful wolf recovery, because if wolves get down here, they're probably going to get shot. And in most states, there's essentially an open killing season on coyotes at present. The southern Lake Champlain Valley connection, SLCV, is a critical one. That's the link between the Adirondacks and the Green Mountains. I'm here with Jerry Jenkins, the great botanist with Northern Forest Atlas Project, and Jamie Phillips and Jennifer Esser of Eddy Foundation on Bald Mountain, southern Lake Champlain Valley. The northern Green Mountains linkage to the Sutton Mountains in southern Quebec is another ecologically critical linkage, part of a rewilding vision for our region, and that one is on the Staying Connected map. This is the Monadnock Highlands in southwest New Hampshire, a wonderful block of intact wildlands, largely where wildlands philanthropists Annie Faulkner and Bob King have done some heroic work. And I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to skip through. There's some other important connections. Bowman Divide, where there desperately needs to be a wildlife crossing on Route 2. The Mahoosics, critical connection between northern New Hampshire and Maine. Maine Woods National Park, David Foster mentioned this morning, one of the great visions, one of the great rewilding visions for our region is Restore's proposed Maine Woods National Park. Three Borders proposed International Peace Park, where Quebec, New Brunswick, and Maine come together, would be a wonderful protection and restoration effort. This is the St. Francis River. We also need to think about waterways. We urgently need to replace deficient culverts and remove unneeded dams to restore safe passage for fish and amphibians. Rewilding is about plants too, of course. We should be thinking about salmon, as John Leibowitz mentioned this morning. This is the Restigouche River, which does still have vibrant salmon populations. This is Gaspésie Provincial Park, where we have the most southerly herd of caribou hanging on barely in the highlands. End of the Appalachians, Forillon Peninsula, where the Appalachians dive into the Atlantic Ocean. And if I can leave you with a happy thought, it is what John said this morning, Puma's coming home. This is a beautiful piece of art by my friend Rod McIver, Puma Almost Home. That is a piece of art that keeps me going. Thank you for your time, and we'll hope for some questions after Abigail's.